Seraphine's eyes, once a vibrant blue that reflected the sky above the grand palace, had dulled with the passage of time on the forsaken planet. The desolate world was nothing like the glittering capital of the Kylar Dominion, where she had once attended lavish balls and lived in the lap of luxury. Now, she was stranded on this barren rock, her only companions the wind howling across the dry, cracked land, and the occasional scavenger animal that dared to roam near her humble shelter. When the king, her father, had cast her aside, the galaxy had not even batted an eye. Political scandals were not uncommon, but none had been as scandalous as her fall from grace. Her father, Azrith, had done what any ruler would. He sacrificed her to protect his empire. The truth of the matter had never been fully revealed, but whispers hinted at a betrayal so deep that even the royal family's reputation could not withstand it. Seraphine's name had become a symbol of disgrace, but Seraphine had survived, not because she was some helpless princess lost in a cruel world. No, she had inherited a strength her father could never understand. Her exile hadn't broken her, it had forged her into something stronger. The harsh landscape of the planet, once thought to be her prison, became her training ground, the red dirt beneath her feet the perfect surface for practice, and the scattered ruins of abandoned outposts offered the only shelter from the endless wind. She spent her days mastering survival skills, hunting, building shelter, scavenging. As her physical strength grew, so did her mind, sharper than the blade she had forged herself. At night, she often sat outside her makeshift shelter, staring at the stars, her thoughts wandering to the kingdom she had been taken from. What had become of her? What had become of her people? Her father's betrayal was a wound she could never heal, but she was not so naive as to think her destiny had been fully written by his cruelty. She could rewrite her own future. Then, one evening, as the double suns began to set, casting a fiery orange glow across the sky, Seraphine heard it, the unmistakable hum of a ship's engines cutting through the still air. Her pulse quickened, her instincts honed through months of isolation kicking in. She moved swiftly, silently, to the edge of the rocky outcrop where she had been watching the stars moments before. There in the distance, a ship was descending. A part of her wanted to ignore it, to remain hidden and continue her life as it had been. But something else stirred in her, a curiosity she could not suppress. Who would be coming to this desolate place, and why? She had never considered the possibility of someone finding her, but as the ship grew closer, she realized it wasn't a military vessel from the Kylar Dominion. The markings on the side were not familiar. The ship was small, sleek, and definitely not one of the standard fleet crafts she had seen in her time at the palace. The ship touched down a short distance from where she stood, and the hatch opened with a hiss. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, with a quick, alert posture. He was wearing combat armor, the kind worn by mercenaries and bounty hunters. Seraphine's heart skipped a beat. She had dealt with scavengers before, but this man looked like someone more dangerous. He wasn't here to rescue her, that much was clear. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice steady but cautious, her hand instinctively resting on the hilt of a blade she had fashioned herself. The man paused, eyes scanning the barren landscape before locking onto her with a piercing gaze. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them crackled with an unspoken tension. "I'm here for you," he replied, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice that suggested he didn't deal in pleasantries. "Princess Seraphine, I presume." Her eyes narrowed. "So the rumors are true. The galaxy thought she was dead, but someone had come searching for her. I'm not a princess anymore," she said, her tone sharp. "Not to you, not to anyone." The man studied her for a long moment, then gave a slight nod. "Maybe. But you're still the one they've been talking about. Still the one who matters." Seraphine clenched her jaw, feeling the weight of her father's betrayal like a sharp stone lodged deep in her chest. She had no interest in being anyone's symbol, least of all a relic from the past. But there was something in the man's words that made her hesitate, something that made her wonder if, just maybe, this wasn't the end of her story, but the beginning of something much bigger. "Who sent you?" she asked. "The galaxy," he said. "It's watching you. You've got a choice to make, princess. You can stay here and die forgotten, or you can fight, and I'll be there to help you if you choose the latter." Seraphine's heart raced as his words echoed in her mind. Fight? Fight for what? For a throne she no longer wanted? Or was there something more to this, something more than just revenge against her father? For the first time in a long while, Seraphine felt the stirrings of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The mercenary stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry earth beneath him. Seraphine stayed rooted to the spot, her eyes never leaving him. Despite the strange calm in his voice, the man was dangerous. She could sense it in the way he moved, the silent confidence he exuded. She had been alone for so long that even the slightest shift in the wind made her hyper-aware. But this was different. This man was no ordinary traveler. He wasn't just another scavenger looking for a quick profit. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice tinged with defiance. "Who sent you? What do you want?" The man's expression didn't change. "I'm not here for you, princess." He almost spat the word out, as if it were a bitter taste. "I'm here for what you could be." Seraphine's brow furrowed in confusion. "What I could be?" "You've got the galaxy watching you, whether you want it or not. The Kylar Dominion, the rebels, the smugglers. Everyone knows your name. You're no longer just the king's daughter. You're a symbol." His eyes softened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "You've got a choice to make. Stay here, or leave and fight." "Fight for what?" she asked, her heart racing. "I've been abandoned. My father." She stopped herself. She hadn't even said his name in years. The mention of her father still sent a cold stab through her chest. "I've got nothing left. I'm no one." "You're wrong about that," he said, and for the first time, he took a step closer. His boots scraped against the rocky terrain. "People like you, people with nothing to lose, are often the most dangerous. That's why they're watching. That's why they haven't forgotten you." Seraphine took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The words stung, but there was something in them that rang true. She had nothing left to lose, but the galaxy was still watching. The galaxy had never stopped watching. "You still haven't answered me. Who are you?" she pressed. He paused, as if considering the weight of his answer. "James Harding, mercenary. Some say I'm the best at what I do." Seraphine studied him, trying to gauge whether his claim was true. The galaxy was full of mercenaries. Some were hired muscle, others were tacticians or spies. It wasn't hard to find someone who could take on a job, but the best. That was a different story. "Why should I trust you?" Her tone was skeptical. "You're a mercenary. You've probably killed more people than I can count. What makes me different?" James's face didn't flinch at her words. "I don't ask you to trust me," he said, voice steady. "But if you want out of here, I'm your best shot. If not, well, you'll die here like the rest of the forgotten." The harshness of his words hit her like a slap. For a moment, she considered refusing him, shutting him out and continuing her life alone. She could survive here. She had been surviving. But the longer she thought about it, the more she realized how little that life had meant. Being alone in exile had made her strong, yes, but it had also made her invisible. To everyone. Seraphine's gaze dropped to the ground. She had spent months running from what had happened to her, trying to forget. But every moment of isolation had made the pain of betrayal burn even deeper. She looked back up at James, his expression unreadable. For the first time, she saw something behind his eyes, a flicker of understanding. He wasn't here to fix her or give her false hope. He was offering something simpler, an opportunity. Seraphine exhaled, her breath shaky, as she took a step forward. "What do you need from me?" James's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, though his eyes remained serious. "I need you to trust me for one thing. Get on the ship. After that, we'll figure it out. Her heart pounded in her chest. The decision was both terrifying and thrilling at the same time. The galaxy had watched her fall. Now, for the first time in years, it seemed ready to watch her rise. "Fine," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "I'll go with you, but I don't make promises. Not yet." James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned and made his way back to the ship, his boots kicking up dust with each step. "That's all I need," he said over his shoulder. "No promises, just the chance to do something about it." Seraphine stood there for a moment longer, the wind sweeping across the barren landscape. She could feel the weight of the choice settling around her like an inevitable storm. She was walking into the unknown, leaving behind the shadows of her past. But as she walked toward the ship, something inside her stirred, a feeling she hadn't known for so long. Hope. The ship was small, sleek, and well-armed, definitely not the kind of vessel that someone like Seraphine had expected to find in the middle of nowhere. Its exterior gleamed under the twin suns as it powered up, its thrusters humming to life. Seraphine climbed aboard with a sense of apprehension she hadn't felt in months, but beneath that anxiety, there was something else. Curiosity. What was she walking into? Was this just another trap, or could this human truly be the ally he claimed to be? Inside, the ship was efficient, if not luxurious. There were no lavish quarters, no signs of wealth or comfort, just cold metal walls, a small galley, and the cockpit up ahead. James led her down a narrow hallway, his pace confident as he motioned for her to take a seat. "Get comfortable. It's going to be a long flight," he said, sliding into the seat next to the controls. Seraphine didn't sit immediately. She took in her surroundings, her eyes darting over the ship's interior. The quiet hum of machinery was the only sound, but she felt her heart racing. Her entire life had been defined by grandeur and royalty, palaces, power, and people constantly vying for her attention. Now she was on a ship in the middle of nowhere, with only a mercenary for company. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, taking a seat beside him, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. James didn't look away from the controls as he spoke. "A few places. First, we'll be making a pit stop at a neutral station on the edge of Kyler territory. I've got a few people there who can help us with supplies and intel. Then we figure out our next move." Seraphine nodded, trying to push her doubts aside. This was happening. There was no going back. For better or worse, her life was now in the hands of a man who didn't seem to care about the legacy of her bloodline. He cared about one thing: survival. "Neutral station?" she asked. "What kind of people are we talking about?" James glanced at her, his eyes sharp. "Mercenaries, pirates, traitors, you name it. It's a place where you can disappear or find trouble, depending on how you play your cards." Her stomach tightened. This wasn't exactly a comforting thought. But as she looked out the viewport at the endless expanse of stars, she realized something. She'd been running from her past for so long. Now, she had no choice but to face the future, and it was unclear whether that future would be brighter or darker than anything she had known. "I've been on my own for a long time," Seraphine said, her voice quiet. "I never thought I'd need anyone." James didn't respond immediately. He just kept his eyes on the stars, his fingers flying over the console as the ship accelerated toward its destination. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice surprisingly soft. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." Seraphine's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. The words were unexpected, unspoken before in a galaxy where everyone had their own agenda, where trust was a currency no one could afford. But something in his voice, something in his words, made her wonder if, maybe, this could be different. She turned toward him, her gaze searching his face. "Why are you helping me?" His eyes flickered for a brief second, and for the first time since she had met him, there was a hint of something deeper in his expression. Something personal, something guarded. "I don't usually do charity," he said, his voice taking on a rough edge. "But you've got the kind of fire that makes people take notice. You could be more than just the disgraced princess of a dying empire. The galaxy needs a change. You could be that change." Seraphine stared at him, processing his words. He was right. In a way, she wasn't just the Forsaken daughter anymore. She was something else, something the galaxy hadn't seen before. She had spent so long wallowing in her pain, in her loss, that she hadn't realized the potential she carried. Maybe she wasn't just a symbol of a broken past. Maybe she was the spark needed to ignite something new. But she wasn't about to admit that to James, not yet. "So, what now?" she asked, changing the subject. "What's the plan?" "We gather allies," he said, his eyes steely again. "We make sure the Kylar Dominion doesn't catch up to us too soon, and we figure out who's really behind your exile, because I'm guessing it wasn't just your father. There's something bigger at play here. And if we're going to stop it, we need to take the fight to them." Seraphine nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. She wasn't just running from her past anymore. She was fighting for something. And for the first time in a long while, she felt the stirrings of hope. Real hope. The kind that didn't come from being told she could be saved, but from the possibility that she could save herself. The ship veered into hyperspace, and the stars streaked by in a blur of light. Seraphine took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the dark void ahead. The galaxy had watched her fall, but they had no idea what she was capable of when she decided to rise. The ship lurched as it exited hyperspace, the stars snapping back into focus like dots of light against the black void. Seraphine leaned forward, her pulse quickening as they neared their first destination, a neutral space station on the edge of Kylar Dominion territory. From the outside, it looked like any other station, dimly lit, industrial, with a few ships docked in the sprawling bay. But she could feel the tension in the air. This was not a place where people made friends. It was a place where you either survived or perished, depending on how well you played the game of power. James was already on his feet, running through final checks on the ship's systems. His focus was razor-sharp, and Seraphine couldn't help but admire the efficiency with which he moved. This was his world, one of chaos, uncertainty, and danger. It was a far cry from the gilded halls of the Kylar Palace, and yet, for the first time since her exile, Seraphine felt a strange sense of freedom. "We'll need to be quick," James said, his voice low and urgent. "Stay close. These people aren't interested in small talk." She nodded, her fingers brushing the hilt of the dagger she had fashioned herself. She had trained relentlessly over the past months, but there was no doubt that this would be her first real test. No longer a princess in exile, but a woman fighting to survive in a galaxy that had long since forgotten her. As they disembarked from the ship and stepped onto the metal platform of the station, Seraphine was immediately hit by the stench of grease and engine fuel. The hum of conversation, mostly in hushed tones, echoed off the walls. It wasn't a busy place, but it was enough to make her feel the weight of every eye on her. She hadn't been this exposed since her public disgrace on Kylar Prime. The difference now was that the eyes that followed her weren't judgmental, they were calculating. They were watching to see what kind of person she was. Would she fight? Would she bow to them? Or would she simply fade into obscurity? James led the way, his pace steady as he navigated through the maze of narrow hallways and dimly lit corridors. Seraphine followed close behind, her every step purposeful, but still alert. Her instincts screamed at her to stay ready, to expect danger at every corner. She wasn't just here to trade supplies. She was here to find something more. Intel, James had said. They needed information. The Kylar Dominion was far too powerful to simply run from. They needed to know where its weaknesses lay, how to strike back. As they entered a larger room, Seraphine noticed a few shady figures huddled in groups, some playing cards, others discussing deals in low murmurs. At the far end of the room was a booth, its occupant looking like he had lived through too many wars. A scar ran across the side of his face, and his eyes gleamed with a predatory sharpness that made Seraphine instinctively reach for her dagger. She kept her hand at her side, though, reminding herself that her life didn't depend on the blade. It depended on her ability to think, to act when it mattered. James spoke first, his voice calm but commanding. "Grim, we need information. You know what's happening on the inside of the Kylar Dominion. We need to know where to strike. And we need to know now." Grim looked up, his expression unreadable. There was no kindness in his face, only cold calculation. He studied Seraphine for a moment, his gaze lingering on her with a mix of curiosity and recognition. The princess, the Forsaken princess. She had become a legend in her own right, her exile a cautionary tale that would be whispered in every dark corner of the galaxy. But to Grim, she was just another pawn in a game that didn't care about bloodlines or titles. "Information isn't free," Grim finally said, his voice gravelly. "But I know someone who might help you." They'd been making moves in the shadows, looking for ways to take down the Kylar Dominion from within. "If you want to get to them, you'll need to prove you're worth their time." James crossed his arms, eyes narrowing. "What do you want in return?" Grim chuckled darkly, the sound sending a shiver down Seraphine's spine. "A favor. A small one. And when I come calling, you'll owe me. That's the deal." Seraphine exchanged a glance with James. She could feel the weight of the moment. A favor, a debt, could be dangerous, but it might be their only shot at gaining the intel they needed. She had no illusions about this world. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a survivor. And if survival meant making deals with people like Grim, so be it. "We'll take the deal," James said after a beat, his voice flat. "But if this turns out to be a trap, you won't get a second chance." Grim's grin was sharp and knowing. "We'll see." As they left the booth, Seraphine couldn't shake the feeling that they had just taken the first step into a world much darker than she had ever imagined. But it was a world she had no choice but to embrace. There was no going back now. The station's atmosphere felt even heavier as Seraphine and James left Grim's booth behind. The deal had been struck, but neither of them could shake the sense of unease that lingered in the air. Grim's words echoed in her mind. "When I come calling, you'll owe me." In this world, debts were dangerous, and it was hard to tell who would collect when the time came. James, however, seemed unfazed. He moved with the same purpose as before, confident in his next steps. The galaxy was a dangerous place, but to someone like him, it was just another day. For Seraphine, though, this new world was foreign, filled with treachery, backroom deals, and violence. She was no longer a princess with a silver spoon, surrounded by loyal couriers. She was something else now. A fugitive, a symbol, and perhaps more importantly, a weapon in a fight she hadn't chosen. They made their way back to the ship, the sounds of the station fading behind them. As they stepped onto the loading ramp, James stopped and turned to her. "Grim wasn't the only one with intel," he said, his voice low. "There are a few others we need to track down before we make our move." Seraphine raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "Who?" "People who've seen what the Kylar Dominion is doing on the fringes. Pirates, smugglers, anyone with enough information to know the Dominion's weaknesses. There's a particular contact on a planet called Voltora. They've been feeding intel to the rebels for months. If anyone can help us take down the Dominion from within, it's them." Seraphine's stomach tightened at the thought. Voltora was a remote planet, known for its lawlessness. It was a haven for those who wanted to disappear, those who had no allegiance to any empire or cause. It wasn't the kind of place that welcomed outsiders, especially not a former princess of the Kylar Dominion. "Isn't that dangerous?" she asked, eyeing him carefully. "A planet like that isn't exactly friendly to anyone who isn't a local." "That's why we'll need to be careful," James replied, his eyes scanning the stars ahead. "But it's the best shot we've got. We'll make contact, get the information, and move on. No delays." Seraphine hesitated. She didn't like the idea of stepping into another unknown world, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the stakes were too high to back down now. The Kylar Dominion had stripped her of everything: her name, her legacy, and her future. If there was any hope of reclaiming her life, of taking the fight back to her father's empire, she had to act. And to do that, she needed allies. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "Let's do it." The decision felt like a weight lifting from her chest, and for the first time since she had been cast out, she felt a spark of purpose. She was no longer a forgotten princess. She was something more, something she had never allowed herself to be before. A leader, ready to take her future into her own hands. James nodded and began to prepare the ship for takeoff. "You might want to get some rest. It'll be a while before we reach Voltora." Seraphine nodded but didn't move. Instead, she watched him for a moment, her mind swirling with thoughts of what lay ahead. She wasn't sure if she could trust James fully, but right now, he was the only person she had. They were in this together, whether she liked it or not. As the ship hummed to life and the engines began to roar, Seraphine found herself staring out of the viewport, watching the stars stretch into streaks as they entered hyperspace. She was leaving behind the ghost of her past and heading into a future where the galaxy was watching her every move. The path ahead would not be easy. It would be filled with danger, betrayal, and uncertainty. But Seraphine no longer feared the unknown. In the vast, unforgiving galaxy, she had a purpose now, and nothing, no one, could take that away from her. The journey to Voltora felt longer than it was. The ship hummed steadily through hyperspace, but Seraphine couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to her like a second skin. The closer they got to the lawless planet, the more her instincts screamed at her to prepare for something she couldn't predict. This was no ordinary mission. This was a chance to set everything in motion, to make the first move in what could be a galaxy-wide war. Voltora was a place where few ventured unless they had a death wish, or if they needed to disappear. It was the perfect refuge for those who didn't want to be found, and exactly the kind of place where you couldn't trust anyone. Seraphine's eyes darted between the ship's control panel and the viewport. James was at the helm, his expression serious, focused. "We're almost there," he said without looking up. Seraphine stood up from her seat, straightening her clothes. "Are we sure about this?" she asked. "Grimm wasn't the only one to warn us about this planet. There's a reason people avoid it." James turned slightly, his gaze briefly meeting hers. "I've been here before. Voltora isn't as chaotic as people think. It has its rules. You just have to know who to trust." Seraphine was skeptical. Trust. That word had lost all meaning to her after the betrayal by her own family. Trusting a mercenary, even one who had helped her escape, seemed like a gamble at best. But she had no choice. If they wanted to strike back at the Kylar Dominion, they needed the information from the rebels or smugglers who had been working in the shadows. As the planet of Voltora came into view, it was clear how much of a contrast it was to the well-maintained and pristine stations of the Kylar Dominion. The surface was covered in craggy mountains, deserts, and swamplands, a hostile, barren landscape that reflected the lawlessness of the people who lived there. Pockets of settlements dotted the planet, hidden in caves or behind layers of thick fog. James didn't waste any time. He immediately engaged the ship's landing gear and piloted the vessel toward one of the larger docking bays. The station here was dilapidated, its edges crumbling from years of neglect, but functional. It was everything Seraphine had imagined, and worse. She could feel the cold eyes of the station's guards on her the moment she stepped off the ship. They were dressed in ragged uniforms, armed to the teeth, but their eyes betrayed their hunger for power. They weren't interested in welcoming new visitors. They were interested in seeing what they could get from them. James motioned for Seraphine to follow him as they stepped into the station's entrance. The air smelled of dust and engine fumes. The walls were covered in faded advertisements for things Seraphine could barely recognize: weaponry, illegal cybernetic modifications, and promises of safe passage to the outermost reaches of the galaxy. "Stick close," James murmured as they navigated through the maze of corridors. "We'll meet the contact in the back room. It's safer there." They passed through several security checkpoints, each more lax than the last, until they reached a nondescript door at the far end of the station. James knocked twice in quick succession. There was a long pause before the door slid open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with people hunched over holographic maps and datapads. At the center of it all stood a tall figure cloaked in shadows. The man, or perhaps woman, was difficult to identify at first glance. They were wearing a dark cloak, their face obscured by a hood, and a long scarf wrapped around their neck. But the moment they spoke, Seraphine knew this was no ordinary contact. "You're late," the figure said in a low, smooth voice. "Did you bring what was promised?" James gave a sharp nod. "We've got the credits, and we need the intel on the Kylar Dominion. Specifically, what's going on in the central sectors?" The figure nodded but didn't immediately hand over the information. Instead, they studied Seraphine with an intensity that made her uneasy. "So it's true," the voice said, almost amused. "The Forsaken Princess is alive. Quite the fall from grace, wasn't it?" Seraphine's fingers clenched into fists at her sides. She was used to the whispers, the mockery that followed her every step, but hearing it so directly still cut deep. "I'm not here for games," she said, her voice hard. "We need that intel, or this meeting's over." The figure chuckled softly, amused by her sudden shift in tone. "Of course, Princess. You may be broken, but you've got the fire. That could be useful. It could also get you killed. We'll see." There was a tense silence as the figure moved across the room, pulling up a holographic map of the Kylar Dominion's territories. With a few quick gestures, they revealed encrypted data showing military bases, rebel movements, and even some of the Empire's internal conflicts. "This is what you wanted," the figure said, tapping the final section of the map. "The Kylar Dominion's weak spots and a few of the more powerful players within the rebellion." James and Seraphine both leaned in, studying the information closely. There were names here, coordinates, and tactical insights that could shift the balance of power. It was everything they needed, and more. Seraphine's heart raced as she took in the data. This was the beginning of something bigger. The galaxy had watched her fall, but now it was going to watch her rise. The figure glanced at her one last time, their voice laced with intrigue. "You're playing a dangerous game, Princess. I hope you're ready for what comes next." With the intel secured, the mood in the dimly lit room shifted from tension to quiet anticipation. Seraphine studied the holographic data in front of her, her mind racing. The Kylar Dominion had made its power felt across the galaxy for decades, but now, for the first time, Seraphine saw the cracks. There were rebels out there, disorganized but growing, and within the heart of the Dominion, there were weaknesses she could exploit. The contact, still hooded and silent, studied her reaction closely. "You're in this now, Princess," they said softly, almost as if speaking to themselves. "You'll need more than information to take them down. You'll need fire." James was the first to speak, his voice firm. "We'll get what we need. Don't worry about us." The figure didn't respond immediately, but there was a flicker of something in their eyes, an unreadable mix of amusement and caution. They slowly lowered their hood, revealing a sharp, angular face, with a scar that ran across their left cheek. There was a dangerous look in their eyes, but also something calculating. They weren't afraid of the Dominion. But the same couldn't be said for Seraphine and James. Not yet. If you really want to fight back, you'll need to form alliances. Real ones, not just fleeting deals with shadows like mine. The contact said, "The Dominion is ruthless, and they'll hunt you down the moment they realize what you're planning." Seraphine absorbed the words, her thoughts swirling. She'd known the risks from the start, but hearing them so bluntly made her realize just how high the stakes were. The past few months had been filled with running, hiding, and avoiding her fate. But now she was standing at the edge of something much bigger. There was no turning back. James leaned forward, his face hardening. "We know the risks, but we're prepared to fight. And if we have to burn the whole thing down to take them with us, we will." Seraphine met his gaze, a quiet understanding passing between them. She had come to rely on him more than she had ever expected. He was a mercenary, a man of action, not words, but he had shown her that even in the darkest places, there could be a glimmer of something more, a purpose. The contact regarded them both for a long moment, their gaze flickering with something like respect, or perhaps curiosity. They finally turned to a nearby console and entered a series of commands, bringing up a series of coordinates on the display. "Here," the contact said, pointing to a remote location on the map. "This is where you start. An abandoned mining colony on the edge of Kyler space. A perfect place for you to make a move without drawing too much attention." Seraphine's eyes narrowed as she studied the location. "What's there?" "Rebels," the contact replied. "And some old military tech that might help you. It's not much, but it's a place to regroup, plan, and start gathering a proper force. It's the beginning of your rebellion, but don't expect them to roll over for you. Convince them you're worth following, or they'll leave you to die." James didn't flinch at the warning. "We can handle that." Seraphine felt the weight of the contact's words. It wasn't just about gathering allies. It was about proving herself worthy of their loyalty. For the first time, she felt a flicker of uncertainty. How could she ask people to fight for her? How could she demand their trust when her own family had cast her aside so easily? But then, something inside her hardened. She had come this far. She had survived. And now, it was time to show the galaxy who she really was. Not the forsaken daughter of a dying empire, but a leader, a fighter. The spark that could ignite the fire of rebellion. "We'll go there," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the room. "But we need your help. You'll point us in the right direction, but we'll be the ones to light the flame." The contact gave her a long, searching look before nodding slowly. "Fine. But remember what I said. The Kylar Dominion isn't like any enemy you've faced before. Underestimate them, and they'll burn you to ash." Seraphine stood tall, her shoulders squared. "I'm done being underestimated." James turned to her with a quick glance of approval, his lips twitching into a rare, fleeting smile. "Let's burn this empire to the ground." With that, the meeting ended, and the contact led them to a secured room where they could rest and prepare for their next move. The intel they had gathered was a powerful tool, but it was only the beginning. Now it was up to Seraphine and James to turn it into action. The battle for the galaxy had begun, and they were standing at the front lines. As they boarded their ship once more, Seraphine took one last look at the dark corridors of the station. The past had been full of betrayals and loss, but as the engines roared to life, propelling them toward their next destination, she realized something. The future wasn't just something that happened to her anymore. It was something she could shape, and she was ready to do just that. The journey to the abandoned mining colony was a quiet one. The hum of the ship's engines filled the air, a constant reminder of the mission that lay ahead. Seraphine sat at the navigation console, eyes scanning the stars as they passed in streaks of light. The coordinates the contact had given them led them far from the heart of Kylar Dominion space into a desolate region of the galaxy where few dared to venture. James was in the cockpit, focused on keeping the ship steady as they passed through the outer rim. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that the path they had chosen was dangerous, but necessary. As the hours ticked by, Seraphine's thoughts turned inward. She had faced countless challenges since her exile, betrayal, isolation, and fear, but none of that had prepared her for what lay ahead. The abandoned colony wasn't just a hideout for rebels. It was a proving ground. If she couldn't convince the scattered fighters there that she was worth following, everything she had risked so far would be for nothing. The thought made her stomach churn, but she refused to let it show. She had no choice but to push forward. When the planet finally loomed into view, A barren rock with little more than jagged cliffs and dusty plains, Seraphine felt her heart race. The mining colony, once a thriving industrial hub, was now a ghost town. Its crumbling buildings stood as a reminder of the galaxy's disregard for anything deemed unprofitable or expendable. The rebels that had taken refuge here were just as forgotten, lost in the shadows of an empire too vast to care. As the ship touched down in the remnants of an old landing bay, Seraphine took a deep breath, bracing herself for what came next. The gravity of the situation hit her then. She wasn't just looking for fighters. She was looking for a cause, a symbol to rally behind. If she failed here, there would be no going back. But if she succeeded, she wasn't just a princess anymore. She would be the leader of something far more important than herself. The hope of the galaxy would rest on her shoulders. The hatch of the ship opened with a hiss, and they stepped into the cold, stale air of the colony. A handful of ragged figures moved in the shadows, their eyes flicking to the newcomers with suspicion. Seraphine's heart thudded in her chest. These people weren't like the nobles of Kyler Prime. They didn't care about titles or bloodlines. They cared about survival. James, as always, took the lead, striding confidently toward the largest structure in the colony, a dilapidated building that had once been a processing plant. He knocked once before pushing the door open, revealing a small group of rebels huddled around a table, speaking in low voices. One of them, a tall man with a weathered face, looked up as they entered. His gaze narrowed when he saw Seraphine. There was no recognition in his eyes, only a cold, calculating look that weighed her presence like an unknown variable. He didn't speak at first, but his silence was more telling than words. "I'm James," the mercenary said, breaking the tension. "We've come to make a deal." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, his gaze flicked between James and Seraphine, as if deciding how much to trust them. Finally, he spoke. "Deal? You're in the wrong place if you're looking for a handout. We don't deal in promises. We deal in results." Seraphine stepped forward, her voice calm but unwavering. "I'm not here for promises. I'm here because the Kylar Dominion is a threat to all of us. And I'm here to show you that we can defeat them." The room fell silent. The rebels exchanged wary glances, sizing her up. There was something about Seraphine, though, that made them hesitate. She was no ordinary exiled princess. She was a woman with a fire in her eyes, a quiet but undeniable confidence that even the hardest of hearts could feel. The man at the table, who seemed to be their leader, leaned back in his chair, eyes still fixed on her. "And what makes you think you can defeat the Dominion? They've crushed every rebellion before you." Seraphine met his gaze without flinching. "Because I've seen what they've done to my people. I've lived through it. I know where their weaknesses lie. And I'm ready to fight. With you. Or without you." There was a long pause, the tension thick in the room. Finally, the man nodded slowly, as if making a decision in that instant. "We'll hear you out," he said, his tone still cautious but more open. "But you better have something better than words to offer." Seraphine nodded. This was just the beginning, but it was a start. She wasn't just a forsaken princess anymore. She was a leader, standing in the midst of those who had been abandoned by the galaxy, ready to fight for something bigger than herself. And if they listened, if they saw her resolve, maybe they would join her, and together they would spark a rebellion that would shake the very foundations of the Kylar Dominion.